would do this series, I was happy to, and whether it would be a multi-part series. I have done Ulysses in 12 meetings and 6 meetings and 4 meetings, and I think it's fair to say I had to sell Rob on the idea that I could do it in 2 in the way that I'm describing, and these are the 2. Tonight as a general introduction to how to read Joyce, an hour and 15 minutes, next time focusing on Ulysses. I want to say that in my long career in education, including my own graduate work and college work, I had 3 instructors who were audacious enough to say on the first day of their class, "You people really smart to sign up for this course." And I want to say to the handful of you, and those of you listening later, you're really smart to take this if you want to know how to read Joyce, because this works. You will not be able to read Ulysses without trouble. It's a troublesome book. But it is more like other novels than it's not like other novels. And if you have a way in, you will feel more comfortable reading and skimming the parts that are incomprehensible. So my habit when I come to Guilford and other libraries is not to talk at people, but to talk with them, but not tonight. This is meant to be a kind of lecture, workshop on this handout and certain passages, so that you hear a lot of me tonight, get your grounding, and when we come back next time, and there'll be another handout available in advance that will also be available at the library with sections of Ulysses. When I talk about reading Ulysses, I don't mean the broad scope of it, which I'll cover too. I mean, how do you make sense out of this page? So I'm not going to read this document to you, but I hope you have read it or will read it. Joyce's method is what has come to be called symbolic naturalism. The Romantics at the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, and in England especially, decided that what was being ignored by Enlightenment and rationalist thinking is the power of the imagination, not common sense like Thomas Paine and the rationalists, but uncommon sense. Supernaturalism, horror, vampires, Dracula, Kubla Khan, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, wacky stuff. And at the same time, they thought an important thing that was being left out of the Enlightenment rationalist 18th century was an emotional connection to nature. So nature as something like the human mind and a celebration of not the rational human mind, but the irrational human mind, were the hallmarks of Romantic literature and thinking. That probably isn't old news to you. But in the 19th century, those 2 strains, the imaginative symbolic and the natural, started to split. And you got people who like to write imaginative literature without any connection to reality. And you had people who wanted to write about naturalism as if they were scientific experiments, like Zola or Theodore Dreiser, or other writers who thought we're products of our natural environment. One of Joyce's revolutionary thoughts is we are natural beings, but part of our nature is we have imagination. So you can write about people's intestines as if they were biological creatures, and you can write about their imagination. Joyce is doing both at once, and that was new. I point out his relationship to Ireland. He was obsessed with Ireland. He left the country, it talks about when he came back, and he wrote about nothing but Ireland for the rest of his life. George Santayana says there is such a thing as a Catholic atheist. It's someone who believes there is no God and Mary is his mother. Joyce is a Catholic atheist. He rejects a religion that he has bred in his bones. He rejects Ireland as a parochial, narrow-minded, bourgeois country that is in his heart and soul. He wrote Dubliners, one of the books we're referencing tonight, a collection of short stories about the people of Dublin, to show his fellow citizens how parochial, how stupid, how narrow-minded, how drunk, how besotted with religion they were. And he absolutely expected that they would say, "Jimmy, you're right, we'll try to do better." They hated him for it, and they didn't celebrate him until after he died, before he reached 60. He actually thought he was going to say to them, "You could do better." It frustrated him no end that Dublin was not one of the great capital cities of Europe. And it never has been one of the great, this is not my opinion, one of the great, it's a lovely place, I'm happy to go there, but It never had the kind of powerhouse connection that London, Vienna, Rome, France, other places had. And he felt it was because the Irish people were getting in their own way. Joyce in his eyes. One way to read Joyce is to realize he was nearly legally blind all of his life. You'll read this or reread it, you'll find he had several operations on his eyes. It means that when you read him, you have to be much more attentive to what's being heard than to what's being seen. Sometimes what he writes about what he sees is not particularly concrete and descriptive, because you feel like he's more in his head than he's in the landscape. But there is an aural, A-U-R-A-L, landscape that he's very attentive to. So when you read Joyce, listen for listening. That one awareness of Joyce's near blindness and how sound matters will help you enormously. So you see at the top of the second page, the second paragraph he says at the end of Portrait that there are a number of things that he fears, including dogs, horses, firearms, the sea, thunderstorms, machinery, the country roads at night. The kind of thing that would frighten someone who can't see. Dogs, horses, firearms. If your hearing is bad, my hearing is bad. When loud noise comes, you don't know where it's coming from. The country roads at night, because he already can't see well. Listen for listening in Joyce. So Joyce says in the fifth and final chapter of Portrait that to be a great artist, he must fly past the nets of nationality, language, and religion. Remember, everything I'm saying in the broad sense is going to be applied to narrow passages. And in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, he's writing always ironically. He is going to be a great artist. He's going to be the artist who writes the book that we're reading called A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Is he great? No, he's a young man. But it's a portrait of an artist as a young man. That is, this and that at the same time. Joyce is always interested in both of everything. So he says, I have to fly past the nets. Why? Because in The Portrait of an Artist, his last name is Daedalus. That is the artificer, the inventor who made the wings to help him and his son fly from captivity, because that's also the man who made the labyrinth. And the king who commissioned the labyrinth imprisoned its creator so that he wouldn't give away the secret of how to get out of the labyrinth. And as you know, young Icarus got too interested in the sun, flew too high, the wax on his wings, his artificial wings melted and he fell. So he uses the image, Joyce does, of a bird flying and says if he wants to be a great artist, he's going to have to fly past three nets that you would capture a bird with: nationality, language, and religion. And he says that his method in the middle of the second page will be silence, exile, and cunning. Exile is the way you fly past the nets of nationality. Get out of town, write from Ireland, about Ireland from a distance. He hated the narrow partisanship of men and women who thought if you wear orange instead of green, or green instead of orange, you're guilty of treason. He thought that was stupid. It's not that he didn't care about the people, he didn't care about the stupidity. He uses silence to fly past the net of language. What's the net of language? He's writing in English. He's an Irishman. He doesn't write in Gaelic. Yeats didn't write in Gaelic. And do you know why? They didn't think they'd be great international writers if they learned the language. They knew that if they wanted to be great, they had to write in English. Yeats did not trouble about it. It annoyed the hell out of Joyce because he made a compromise to write in the language of his oppressors, of the imperialists, if you will. So one way to avoid the limits of language is silence. That is, imply things, nuance, poetry, what you don't say, what's called the parabolic mean. You know a parabola? Parables, Jesus' parable. You're here, and you want to get to here, but instead of going this way, you take the parabolic way, and you go around. You get to the same place, it takes longer, and it's not literal. I was lecturing the other night on the power of poetry, and I said to the group, if you say to somebody, my nearest neighbor out in the woods is 150 yards away, people say, okay, I have an idea what that's like. But if you say, my nearest neighbor is just a stone's throw away, unless you're someone whose English is not good or you're very young, you know immediately how far a stone's throw is. Because it's this kind of description. It's not numerical. 150, maybe 150 too much, 100 yards away is absolutely indisputable, but it doesn't have nuance. It doesn't have an image. Maybe you know what 100 yards looks like, but to say just a stone's throw away, an eighth of a teaspoon of salt is a measure, but a pinch of salt is a feeling. So the silence is not to say nothing, but not to explicitly say everything you mean. Part of Joyce. And lastly, cunning is how to get past the restraints of religion. The problem of religion in James Joyce is it's the Catholic religion. I say this not to be autobiographical, but I'm a Catholic. I'm still a Catholic. And I understand what he means, that his problem with the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church wants to get rid of a lot of human biology and sexuality and imagination. This is not a political conversation. This is about Joyce. And Joyce believes all the doors of experience should be opened, and we'll see what he means by how, in his view, a almost state system of Roman Catholicism. You couldn't get a divorce in Ireland until the 1970s. A church allowed divorce until the 1970s. He felt that the problem with religion was not believing in God, but believing that you had to get rid of a lot of human experience. I'll make that concrete in a moment. So the way to fly past the net of nationality, exile, go away, silence, don't say everything you mean, cunning, don't think religiously, think artistically, don't think devoutly, think deceptively, are kinds of detours at the bottom of the page. And my favorite line in Ulysses, and one of my favorite lines in literature, is when Bloom thinks that the longest way round is the shortest way home. The longest way round is the shortest way home. Bloom says it because he realizes that if he takes the main street home, it's most crowded with people and traffic and people selling goods, and it will actually delay him. So you've all driven somewhere where you know this is true, the longest way around geographically turns out to be the shortest way home in terms of time. But what Joyce means is, if you want to experience life, it doesn't make sense to go from A to B along the straight line. Go the long way around. This meeting tonight is a detour. When you go to a symphony orchestra or a play, or you watch a TV show, you're taking a detour. Life has stopped, and you're doing this other thing, and at the end of it, you're back in life. If you're going to the play or the symphony, or Lord help us this, in order to increase your relationship to life, you've gotten home by going the longest way. You know people who don't like to read books, and they will say to you, how can you spend your time on a beautiful day like reading a novel? What are you doing? And you say, well, what are you doing today? Oh, I'm sitting outside in the sun. Okay, well, that's good, but I'm actually reading a book and living another kind of reality. Have you heard of St. Petersburg and Anna Karenina? You know, that kind of thing. You take detours to go out of your way to get more on the way home or to wherever you're going. So, I'm going to give you two examples of detour reading. That's what I call it. You won't find this in Joyce literature, how to read for the detours in Portrait of an Artist. So in chapter 1, within 10 pages of the opening of this very autobiographical novel, very much based on Joyce, but also written in the third person. So Stephen is another person, and there you get the tension already. Is this about Joyce's own life? It is. And it isn't. It's a third-person autobiography. Is it about someone who's going to be a great artist? Yes, but he's a young man. At the end of the work, he produces a work of art. Does anyone remember what he writes at the end of Portrait of an Artist in the 5th chapter? He writes a diary. that is the least imaginative, most pedestrian kind of writing you could do. Writing about your own life, not even artistically, just by entries. But it's the beginning because he's a young man. Always think of this and that. In fact, I teach my undergraduates that all great literature is filled with tension. There's a protagonist in a play who is moving the agon, the agony, the conflict. That's what agony means, agon means. He's moving it forward, or she's moving it forward. And there's an antagonist who wants to push back against that. That conflict makes the drama. They asked Tom Stoppard why he gravitated in the many kinds of writings he did as a young man to drama when he wrote so well in so many other genres. And he said it's the best form in which I can contradict myself. When you read Othello, know that Shakespeare is as interested in Iago as he is Othello. If Shakespeare didn't see the attractiveness of Iago or Richard or King Lear, he wouldn't be a dramatist. It's not all on one side, it's both sides. And I tell my undergraduates, if you take a violin string and hold it at one end without tension and you pluck it, nothing happens. But if you make a tension between this and that and pluck it, then it makes music. All great literary art is based on some kind of tension. So this is early in the novel, and I've made dark in bold the words dark and darkly to make a point. So he's a young man in essentially grammar school. The bell rang for night prayers, and he filed out of the study hall after the others and down the staircase and along the corridors to the chapel. The corridors were darkly lit, and the chapel was darkly lit. You hear how it reads like a primer, right? The repetition of forms like a kid's. He's channeling in his writing the kind of intelligence he had as an 8 or 10-year-old. Soon all would be dark and sleeping. There was cold night air in the chapel, and the marbles were the color the sea was at night. The sea was cold day and night, but it was colder at night. It was cold and dark under the seawall beside his father's house. But the kettle would be on the hob to make punch. The simplicity is because Joyce is having us experience in his prose now what he was like then. The prefect of the chapel prayed above his head, and his memory knew the responses. So he's talking about what he hears. What does a prefect look like? Who knows? No description whatsoever. The description is about being dark and darkly lit, but not about what you see. Then the prayer. Then there was a cold night smell in the chapel, but it was a holy smell. It was not like the smell of the old peasants who knelt at the back of the chapel at Sunday Mass. There was that was a smell of air and rain and turf and corduroy, something a blind boy would notice, that when the peasants come in, you smell their clothing. It's a holy smell because they're peasants in church. But it's not the holy smell of the chapel, which is incense and wax and that kind of thing. They breathed behind him on his neck, again, not seeing but feeling, and sighed as they prayed. They lived in Clane, a fellow said, countryside. There were little cottages there, and he had seen a woman, that's this other fellow, standing at the half door of a cottage for one night with a child in her arms. I'm sorry. He had seen a woman standing at the half door of a cottage with a child in her arms as the cars had come by from Salins. It would be lovely to sleep for one night in that cottage before the fire of smoking turf, in the dark lit by the fire, in the warm dark, breathing the smell of the peasants, air and rain and turf and corduroy. But oh, the road between the trees was dark. You would be lost in the dark. It made him afraid to think of how it was. He heard the voice of the prefect of the chapel saying the last prayers. He prayed it too against the dark outside under the tree. And what I ask my college student readers is, how did he go from it would be lovely to sleep in that cottage to, oh, the road there was dark, you'd be lost in the dark. It made him afraid to think of how it was. What in the passage accounts for this boy thinking longingly how it would be nice to be in that cottage that his friend saw and sleep for one night there before the fire of smoking turf in the dark, lit by the fire in the warm dark. And then all of a sudden, it made him afraid to think how it was. So I'm going to answer my own question. It's because the woman standing at the half door of a cottage with a child in her arms is a welcoming image of motherhood. You know what a cottage door is? Country door sometimes. So you can keep the bottom closed to keep the animals and the dirt out. You have the top open to do business, to talk to neighbors. She's standing at the half-open door of a cottage, and she has a child in her arms. That is an image of maternity. The Catholic Church is very big on maternity, as long as you don't have to have sex to get there. I'm not dismissing the Catholic Church. Again, Joyce thinks that the problem with the Catholic Church is the Madonna is fine if she has breasts and is nursing and a mother. But let's not think about what's below her waist, which is what the other half of the cottage door covers up. It's a symbolic, natural image. And if you understand what I'm saying now, you'll have a leg up on understanding Ulysses. Absolutely natural and realistic that a boy traveling by car could see a woman at a half-open country door holding a baby, and we don't see her lower regions. But Joyce imagines what's behind there that the Catholic Church has told him, never you mind. Nobody talks about that in Ireland in that day. And to think about that is scary because he's a kid. Because sexuality is frightening, especially if you've been raised in a country that demonizes it. And so the key to understanding Joyce is he wants all doors to be open. He wants you to think that women have maternity and they are also capable of seductiveness. They have breasts, they have vaginas. The whole deal of it is one of the things he's trying to embrace as an artist who is flying against the wind in the early part of the 20th century in Ireland. In Ireland. That's the way this detour reads. His imagination captures the hidden danger of the woman's sexuality, but he doesn't express it. You have to see the detour. And you can only do it by reading Joyce more and more. So, example 2 from Portrait happens at the very end of chapter 3. There are 5 chapters, so it's kind of like a 5-act play, in which he has visited a prostitute in the 2nd chapter because he has to experience what the surrender to sexual pleasure will bring him. The now teenage Stephen Dedalus has decided that if he's going to be an artist, he has to know what it's like to have sex. This is one of the novel's several encounters, and that has a very special significance in all of Joyce's writing. Ulysses is baggy in part because Bloom is what's called a clubbable man. He likes to hang out with other people. He's interested in encountering. All real living is encounter, says Martin Buber. If you want to know what it's like to be alive, you have to go out. You have to meet other people. And this is one of the encounters he decides to have. There is in Dubliners a story called an encounter. It's unpleasant. And there's a story in which a boy goes on a retreat, the opposite of an encounter. So in chapter 3, the middle chapter of the novel, Stephen goes on a religious retreat. Some of you may be aware of that phenomenon, Catholic and other Christian, and maybe other religions as well. He listens to 3 long sermons on the foulness of sin and the urgent need to repent. It's really quite disgusting. I'm sure it's very close to the truth. And he makes his confession, and then he believes that he has been basked in the light of God's mercifulness. That is, he's gone from succumbing to the sensation of sex to now being holy. That's always a danger. He's ping-ponged from this to that. In Joyce, you want this and that at the same time. So, later in the same chapter, he sits by the fire in the kitchen, not daring to speak for happiness. This is not what Joyce means when he talks about silence. How do we know? Here's what follows in the chapter. So he's just said his confession, he's taken communion, he hasn't eaten because you have to fast in the morning, and he is slap happy with blessedness. Till that moment, he had not known how beautiful and peaceful life could be. The green square of paper pinned round the lamp cast down a tender shade. This is very common. You buy a lampshade that's clear or white because the colored ones are more expensive, and then you put colored paper around it. And what color? Green. On the dresser was a plate of sausages and white pudding, and on the shelves there were eggs, that is, waiting for the breakfast to be had. They would be for the breakfast in the morning after the communion in the college chapel. White pudding and eggs and sausages and cups of tea. How simple and beautiful was life after all. Life lay all before him. Something's wrong. What's wrong? I've already said that it's always dangerous when Joyce is going too far in one direction. It would make perfect sense that a curious young man, especially someone who believed that to be an artist you need a full range of experience, that he would go to a prostitute. He's not likely to find a willing partner any other way. Maybe he wanted the extra shame that was involved in going to a prostitute. But what's wrong with this scene? So I'll answer my own question again, but when we get to Ulysses next time, you're on the spot. White pudding, sausages, calling Dr. Freud, cups of tea, eggs, white pudding and sausages. Can't anyone get their mind in the gutter for just a couple of seconds? It's images of sex, sausages and white pudding, eggs. Freud says that in our dream world, any container is often a symbol indirectly of the womb. Now, I said symbolic naturalism. It's so natural that there could be breakfast pudding.
They would normally have black pudding anyway.
But, right, and you see the difference that white pudding makes, but don't explain it in too much detail, right? But the point is, those are things that absolutely could be for breakfast, so much so that you don't notice them. But when you have someone like me point it out, right, that's this. Show you the other thing that can mean. There was an old joke about a psychiatrist showing somebody a series of Rorschach blots, ink blots, and says, what is this? That's 2 giraffes having sex, says the patient. What is this? That's 2 butterflies having sex. What about this? 2 hyenas having sex. Every picture I show you, you think animals are having sex. Well, why is that? You're the one with the dirty pictures. Joyce is putting that there silently. The sex is in this scene without being expressed. It's not because he's afraid of censors. It's because this is his method to reach out to the people who are sensitive enough to get what's not being said. What matters in that scene is both what he says, he's slap happy with blessedness, and what he doesn't say, sausages or phallic symbols. Now, just those 2 examples of the cottage door and the breakfast should be pretty potent. And this is in an early work. This is everywhere in Ulysses. I don't mean every couple of pages has sexual images and images of fear, but often this parabolic or detour method is operative. So Some Themes in Dubliners, and Dubliners is a very good book to read as an introduction to Ulysses. It's a collection of short stories, so it has the advantage of being short. It is pitched so that the first stories are not only about children, but they are simpler, and then adolescents, and then adults, and then married adults, and then people in public life, as if the book is growing up with us as we go. The first 3 stories are in first-person narration told by kids because that's how kids see the world. And the adolescent stories go to third person because adolescents are more socialized and so on. So in the first paragraph of the story of the sisters, he says, every night as I gazed up at the window of the house of the dying priest, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It always sounded strangely in my ears like the word gnomon in the Euclid and the word simony in the Catechism. So those three words are italicized in Joyce, and he, through this child who's another surrogate for him, is fascinated by the sound of those odd words. And I'm telling you that the meaning of those words informs Joyce's method. So, paralysis, many characters in Dubliners are paralyzed morally or socially. A young woman is invited to escape her narrow life with a guy named Frank, a sailor, and go to Buenos Aires, and she fears that if she goes, she'll drown with him. People are being told to get out of their shell, and they're too fearful. The priest in the first story is paralyzed before he dies. People cannot take a stand. They cannot escape. Paralysis is everywhere. That's the easy one. A gnomon in Euclid is a plane figure formed by removing a similar parallelogram from a corner. So we won't get too complicated. If you look at this figure, A, B, C, D, the outer parallelogram, has in it a smaller parallelogram, A, G, E, F. If you take that smaller one away, you have this figure, like a big 7, that odd figure. A gnomon is also the name of the indicator on a sundial, that odd P shape. That is, it's a fragment that results when something is taken away. If you only saw that shape like a 7, I don't have a blackboard here, but you all know what I'm saying, right? Yeah. You would know that this piece was there before, right? You would see that this fragment is a fragment that would be completed if you put that piece back in. Joyce writes about people who have fractured families, fractured backgrounds, some developmental gap that we can intuit if we get the shape of who they are. We can imagine what was there before by its absence. If this picture was on this wall for decades and then removed, it would leave behind a brighter patch of this material that wouldn't have been discolored as much as the rest from the lights and the sun because it was protected by the picture beamer. You've had that at home. You take down a painting and there's a space. What was there before? You don't know, but you know something was there before, and you know the shape of it because the gap tells you the shape. Something is present by its absence. I call that a ghost. Am I going too fast? In Joyce, he's fascinated by that idea of a ghost, knowing what's not there because it's present by its absence. If I have my Aunt May still alive, she's not still alive, she's here. And if she's dead and I never think of her, she's gone. But if she's dead and she comes to me in a memory, in a dream, in a ghostly visitation, she's here and she's not. She makes her present felt by reminding me of her absence. Every time you grieve for something gone, whether it's a person or a place or an experience like your childhood, that thing has become present by its absence. It's reminded you that it's gone. It's like the comment, no comment. You have anything to say? No comment. That is, I'm actively saying nothing. Here's a piece of paper. It's blank. My comment is present by its absence. It's another kind of silence. It has the kind of paradoxical nature of religion, 3 persons and one God and all those. But Joyce is fascinated by this is how the mind works. We experience things by their absence. Emily Dickinson's body of work is loaded with absences, deaths, partings, illnesses, the idea that we experience things by having them taken away. Hunger is a feeling that eating takes away, something like that. No, hunger is a feeling that entering takes away. As soon as you get a chance to eat, you don't have the hunger anymore. You feel the hunger because it's present by the absence of food. So we can think, bottom of page 4, of some of the characters or families or institutions in the book as vestiges or fragments of their common selves, but it's also useful to think of it as a key to his style. He offers a portion of a whole picture, and we need to do some of the work imagining, intuiting, reading the wholeness out of the part that Joyce gives us. That makes sense? We've got to fill in the missing part. And why is it paralysis, and why is it simony, and why is it nomen? Because he's intoxicated with language. Some of you who do crossword puzzles and are fascinated by thesauruses and word games and maybe Wordle now, you love words. You just love the playfulness of words. That's Joyce. And so rather than vestige, he has nomen. Also, these are books he read in his education. So the architecture of Dubliners I'm going to skip right now, but I want to encourage you that if you've never read Dubliners or haven't read it lately, that section will be helpful to you in reading the novel, the collection of short stories. It's actually a short story cycle that is a collection of short stories that you experience as a book. What's common to all the stories are the people of Dublin, and the fact that it starts with younger people and gets progressively more mature is almost as if Dublin has its own biography written by Joyce. So I encourage you to check out those instances. But we're going to look at 3 detour readings from Dubliners now to make the point again that we made in Portrait, now in Dubliners. There's a story called Araby. It's the 3rd story of the volume. All 3 of the first stories are narrated by unnamed boys who live in broken families, often with an aunt and uncle. And you get the sense that each boy is slightly older than the boy before, and the last boy in Araby is pre-adolescent, and he's old enough to be sweet on Mangan, one of his friend's sisters. Mangan's sister is never named. She's Mangan's sister. And he likes her well enough that he'd like to go to Araby, Arabia, the name of a bazaar that the local church is putting on to raise some money. He'd like to go there with her, but she's going on a retreat that weekend, a religious retreat. So he has offered to go for her and get her something from the fair, going to Arabia, like the Crusaders went to the Middle East. So in the second paragraph of that story, before we know all that, the boy on the verge of adolescence experiences first love, the narrating boy describes the circumstances of the former tenant of his family's house, a priest who had died in the back drawing room. And then the boy turns his attention to the backyard. The wild garden behind the house contained a central apple tree and a few straggling bushes, under one of which I found the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump. That's one sentence. Anyone want to unpack that a little bit? No sausages. No women at a country door. Don't be shy. This is being recorded, but don't be shy. No one wants to take a guess at what's not being said here? Ladies and gentlemen, a wild garden with an apple tree? You never read Genesis? Come on, don't hold back. It's the Garden of Eden. You agreeing with me? Where were you 5 minutes ago? I'm kidding. What about the bicycle pump?
What I did symbolically, I left my hearing aids at home.
Oh, I'm sorry, so did I. Okay, that's fair enough. Thank you. Would you like to say something about the rusty bicycle pump? Can you hear me all right?
I heard what you said about the rusty bicycle pump. If it's rusty, it's not effective.
Yes, but what do you think he's actually seeing when he finds under the bush the rusty bicycle pump? What does a bicycle pump look like?
A snake with
A snake. It has the pump part and it has the hose part.
Right.
And if you're talking about a wild garden, not a cultivated garden, maybe a garden that's no longer being cultivated, with an apple tree, pile it on, Joyce, you don't want people to miss it, and one of the things he sees is a bicycle pump. If you see it instead of pass over it, it's like a snake in a wild garden with an apple tree. It's because this boy is on the verge of sex. Now, let's be clear. Joyce isn't saying sex is everywhere. Joyce is saying he's putting sex in places, because his upbringing was constantly eradicating it. And he's trying to send the signal to you that life is not simple and beautiful the way the kid waiting for the sausages and eggs is thinking. It's complicated and beautiful. It's complicated and degrading. It's complicated and disgusting. It's everything. That's why in Joyce, men masturbate and they urinate, and he talks about bathroom habits. He's not just trying to shock you. He's trying to shock you. He's trying to say, that's the deal. This is what it means to be a human being. He's in the best spirit of Homer and Rabelais and Cervantes and Shakespeare, who don't give a damn about the fine sensibilities of people who don't want to hear farts. He's writing broadly, and this is a little hint that this boy is on the verge of a fall. The Garden of Eden, the fall. After thinking that he carries his romantic love for Mangan's sister, we never hear her name, we never hear the boy's name, among the drunken men and bargaining women, he says, I bore my chalice safely through a throng of foes. He has money that his uncle gave him belatedly. His uncle forgot and came home late from work. He's taking this coin to Araby, and he is protecting it as he marches through, bores his chalice safely through a throng of foes, like a crusading knight who has a chalice. Where does this boy get the idea of a chalice? Because he was raised in Catholic school. And the chalice is something sacred. And the only way he can think about how much he loves this girl is the language that he was given by religion. He's going to protect this gift of the money to buy her something, even though he's passing through these drunken women. So remember, she's away at a retreat. And then he gets there. He gets to the bazaar. You've been to bazaars. It's in a big church hall, and he's gotten there late because his uncle forgot to come home on time. And he says, he narrates, nearly all the stalls were closed. This is the boy talking. I've made bold all the words that rhyme with hall. And the greater part of the hall was in darkness. I recognized the silence like that which pervades a church after a service. Well, that's good. That's the silence he wants. He thinks of himself as a crusader. If you have a religious feeling for your girlfriend who's not yet your girlfriend, you like the idea that it seems like a church. You're doing something holy. I walked into the center of the bazaar timidly. A few people were gathered about the stalls, which were still open, before a curtain over which the words Café Chantant were written in colored lamps. Two men were counting money on a salver. I listened to the fall of the coin. And then he says, remembering with difficulty why I had come. Why? Why does, in a moment of a few sentences after entering, he's been waiting all evening for his uncle to come home to give him the money to get there. Why does he have difficulty thinking why he had come? Would anyone like to take a guess? Because the Café Chantant, the colored lamps, men counting money, the fall of coins, all runs against his sense that he's in a church. It's unholy. In fact, in one of the Gospels, when Jesus is being crucified, there are men gambling on a tray, coins on a salver. Stall, hall, stall, fall. Well, hall is a neutral word, but stall as a verb is not a very neutral word. And the fall of coins is not very good. And fall harkens back to the wild tree with the apple. And stall is what he's doing, remembering with difficulty why. All of a sudden, the boy stalls without explanation because Joyce is being silent. He's doing this again. And if you're sensitive to reading, you realize, oh, he wanted it to be like a church. A church bazaar isn't church-like. It's carnival-like. It's Café Chantant. It's colored lamps. Remembering with difficulty why I'd come, I went over to one of the stalls and examined porcelain vases and flower tea sets. He wants to get her something girly. At the door of the stall, that word 5 times, 4 times, a young lady was talking and laughing with 2 young gentlemen. I remarked their English accents, never good in Joyce. You want to make an appearance in a James Joyce novel? Don't have an English accent. and listened vaguely to their conversation. Joyce did not believe in quotation marks. He thought they were a distraction, so he uses these dashes. Other writers in his day and since have picked them up. Oh, I never said such a thing. Oh, but you did. Oh, but I did. Didn't she say that? Yes, I heard her. This is the girl talking about it. Never said. Oh, there's a ... fib. Observing me, the young lady came over and asked me, did I wish to buy anything? The tone of her voice was not encouraging. She's flirting with two Englishmen. This kid comes over to her stall at the end of the day. You don't have to have been in retail to know that she's not happy to see him. What, can I help you, kid? Go away, son, you bother me. I looked humbly at the great jars that stood like Eastern guards at either side of the dark entrance to the stall and murmured, no thank you. If he imagined himself a crusader, those big jars like Eastern guards, you know, Aladdin, are chasing him away. No thank you. The young lady changed the position of one of the vases. You can see it, right? She's fussing. And went back to the two young men. They began to talk on the same subject. Once or twice, the young lady glanced after me over her shoulder. Now, before we get to how he feels, can anyone tell me what the silence of the ellipsis, the ... means?
Curse word?
Sorry?
A curse word?
She probably would have said to them something like, well, that's a bloody lie.
Right.
Which in Ireland, even now, is not a nice word. And if I've offended anybody, too bad. She would have said that, but she didn't because there's a kid in the room. She would have said, as part of the playfulness, not out of anger, but out of sassiness, sauciness, oh, that's a bloody lie. And he knows that she paused and said the kid word, fib, to infantilize him. He's thinking of himself heroically, and she's basically done this to him, to our viewers who are listening. Oh, am I being visually recorded? Am I? Oh, so she's done this to him. There. And that stings, because he's been thinking of himself as a hero. I lingered before her stall, though I knew my stay was useless, to make my interest in her wares seem the more real. I want her to know that I'm still shopping. Then I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed 2 pennies to fall. Remember, he had to go on the more expensive, well, remember if you've read the story, he had to go on the more expensive entrance because it's so late and he has less money to buy things with. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery and the light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. Gazing up into the darkness. Gazing is a word that occurs very frequently in Joyce. It's not looking or seeing, it's gazing. It can be someone stupefied, someone entranced, someone daydreaming, someone thinking about something important that is or isn't there. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. Where did that come from? Maybe this kid is 11. Anyone here who's a parent or an aunt or an uncle, and you say to someone, your teenage boy or girl or niece or nephew comes home, and they say, honey, what's the matter? And she says, you know, today I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. Billy, are you okay? It's not the language of an 11-year-old. It's not the language of this kid. It's as if in that moment of realizing that his illusion that he was a big kid or a young man or a hero evaporates by the treatment of someone else. He's had an encounter that has stalled him, and he's retreating into an image of himself as a foolish creature. Is all that making sense? And the register of a creature driven and derided by vanity is so out of tone with the little boy that we realize the grown-up man, whether it's Joyce or a Joycean narrator, has reminded us that this still hurts him now. When you read Angela's Ashes, the great thing about that memoir that revolutionized publishing decades ago was that the entire time you read it, you're with the author back in his youth. He never says at one moment, of course, years later when I thought about this and was in America, no. The entire time of the novel, until he leaves Ireland, the memoir, you're in the boy's mind wherever he is in his development. That's a very difficult thing to do. It's what Dickens does in David Copperfield, and even more importantly, in Great Expectations. All of a sudden, the illusion that I'm a kid who really can act like a man gets shattered. And you see again in that last section before gazing up, stall, fall, haul, call. That's impressive, right? I don't mean me, I mean Joyce.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the child doesn't have the language.
Say it louder for me.
The child doesn't have the language
Right.
to express that emotion that is so powerful that he feels it when he's our age.
Right, exactly. And what Joyce does is have his narrator, who is the boy, all of a sudden get grown up to tell you now, this is what I thought of myself as then. And also, we also know that if we were there, we'd say to this kid, Timothy, get over it. It's not a big deal. There's a Dick Van Dyke show, I'll get to in a moment, where Jerry Van Dyke, his actual brother, has had a love affair by letter, he's in the army, with a woman, and he comes to meet her, and his heart is broken. Jerry Van Dyke, the Dick Van Dyke show, Mary Tyler Moore.
Right.
And he says, Jerry Van Dyke, to his brother Dick, nobody knows how I feel. And Dick said, no, really, brother, whatever his name is, I love you, I know how you, nobody knows how I feel, just like an adolescent. He said, no, we know how you feel. Everybody knows how you feel, says Dick Van Dyke. And Jerry Van Dyke says, oh, that's such a relief. Everybody knows how this kid feels. But in the moment, he's a creature driven and derided by vanity. And you're not going to take that away from him. Just again, like if you had it's because the story's about an adolescent. If you have a pre-adolescent, if you have an adolescent, you know what I mean. I'm not mocking them. Of course it's the end of the world. Sir, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to point out that when you were talking earlier, the comparison between Angela's Ashes, the young
Yes,
man, the
yes.
protagonist, are so similar to what you just read
Yes.
to us, and that he had, it seems to me, he was very grown up and had very adult, mature thoughts in Angela's Ashes.
I don't deny that, but he's never letting you know that he's writing from the perspective of now. Many memoirs will say halfway through, years later when I look back on that scene, I thought, he never does that. That's what I mean. The setting is always then. Yeah.
But it was ringing to me, the comparison.
I understand. Yeah. So the third passage comes from the very end.
I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, just speak up.
Do you think it's Joyce talking here when he talks about his eyes burning?
You have to talk louder for me. Yeah, thank you.
If Joyce is saying his eyes are burning.
Yes.
That's relating to Joyce's vision problems.
I certainly think that his center of interacting with the world is his eyes. Yes. So, we have to be careful not to overread, but I think it's better to guess too much than too little. Yeah, good call. So there's a story called The Painful Case, which is within the story the name of a newspaper article about a woman in the story who either intentionally or accidentally kills herself by drunkenly crossing train tracks and being hit by a train. Many of the characters in Dubliners could be called a painful case, an example of a sad story. So in it, there's a man named James Duffy, who's a version of what James Joyce thought he might have become if he never left Ireland. Very conscious of writing, very abstemious, maybe not being involved in sexuality. He felt that when he met Nora, and by the way, on the front page, there's a mistake I apologize for of the handout. Joyce in his eyes talks about his legendary rendezvous with Nora Barnacle on the 10th of June. That should be the 16th of June, That, of course, is the Bloomsday. The reason for the mistake is they first met on the 10th of June. They did meet on the 10th of June. She was a maid in a hotel. He met her and he asked her out. They went out on the 16th of June. So that should be the rendezvous, in the sense of the date, is the 16th of June. Almost certainly they had sex. That passage figures very prominently at the end of Ulysses. He said to his friends that she made him a man, which was the language of the day. But Joyce feared that if he had stayed in Ireland, he would have led a kind of monk-like life. And so in The Painful Case, the title comes from a newspaper story. I'm on the bottom of page 7, about 5 lines up. A death, possibly a suicide, of a married woman who had sought passion with her relationship when what he wanted was a confessor, someone to wear away the rough edges of his character, someone to emotionalize his mental life. He wanted her as someone he could talk to but not be passionate with. And by the end of the story, we realize it's Mr. Duffy who's the painful case. Mrs. Sinico is married in a loveless marriage. She connects with James Duffy, who is glad to have a confidant if she will do what he wants, which is to emotionalize his life. But she makes the mistake one day of taking his hand and putting it on her face. And he's horrified. Taking his hand and putting it on his own face, because he won't do it. And he cuts off all contact with her, because that's not what he wants. Because he's the James Joyce who hasn't become James Joyce and is terrified of sexuality.
Did you say taking his hand and putting it on his own face? Or
Her face.
Taking his hand and putting it on her face,
Oh, on her, okay.
so that he's forced to touch her.
Yeah.
I was teaching this course, I'm 69 in a few days, when I was in my 30s at Trinity College. And one of the athletes in class, I remember this very well, said, "That's stupid." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, what's the big deal? What's the big deal of her taking his hand? So I went over to him and I said, "Can I have your hand?" And he gave it to me and I started to put it on my face. And he freaked out. And I said to him, "What's the big deal?" He said, "Okay, I get it." And he did. It's an incredibly intimate thing to do. There are not many people outside of your love life, your friendship life, your family life, that you would feel comfortable taking their hand and putting it on your face. He's horrified. She becomes so despondent that their friendship is over. She just wanted some physical touch, that she drinks too much. She gets run over by a train, and there's a story in the paper called A Painful Case. That is her story. So then we have this passage. He's walking away from the restaurant, having just read that story and feeling bad that this is what happened to her. So he's walking in a park. When he gained the crest of the Magazine Hill, and everything in Joyce is an actual geographic location, he bragged to his brother that if Dublin were destroyed by firebombing, they could reconstruct the city from his writing. And he's only partly kidding. He halted and looked along the river towards Dublin, the lights of which burned redly and hospitably in the cold night. He looked down the slope, and at the base, in the shadow of the wall of the park, he saw some human figures lying. Those venal and furtive loves filled him with despair. He gnawed the rectitude of his life. He lives in a room where everything's black and white. All the books are arranged in size order, not by titles or who wrote them. He's gnawing, he's chewing on the rectitude, the rightness of his life. He felt that he had been outcast from life's feast. Those people making out in the park are enjoying life and he's not. One human being had seemed to love him, and he had denied her life and happiness. He had sentenced her to ignominy, a death of shame. He knew that the prostrate creatures down by the wall were watching him and wished him gone. That is, they don't want him there. He's like a voyeur. He can't see them. It's Joyce. No one wanted them. He was outcast from life's feast. He turned his eyes to the gray, gleaming river winding along towards Dublin. Beyond the river, he saw a goods train winding out of Kingsbridge Station like a worm with a fiery head, winding through the darkness obstinately and laboriously. It passed slowly out of sight, but still he heard in his ears the laborious drone of the engine reiterating the syllable of her name. He turned back the way he had come, that is, he retreats. He turned back the way he had come. He was starting to feel a little guilty. He was starting to feel that he had not treated her well. That's a good thing. And then he turns around and goes back the way he came. The rhythm of the engine pounding in his ears. He began to doubt the reality of what memory told him. Maybe I wasn't so mean to her, really. He halted under a tree and allowed the rhythm to die away. The rhythm of the train makes him think of her name for whatever reason. He's standing by the tree, not listening to the rhythm dying away. He's allowing it to die away because that's the ghost of her. That's the reminder of her absence that he felt guilty for. But he can't bear that he might be guilty. So he allows the rhythm to die away. He could not feel her near him in the darkness, nor her voice touch his ear, which he's happy about because he doesn't want to feel guilty about what he did to her. For a moment, he might have had an insight. He waited for some moments listening. He could hear nothing. The night was perfectly silent. He listened again, perfectly silent. He felt that he was alone. That's the painful case. Feeling that he's alone is where he wanted to get to. But he also has to take the time to do it. He undoes the education he might have had for himself. Have you ever been in your house alone at night and you do something and it makes a noise and you're not sure whether that was the floorboard where you were walking or if there's someone in the house, and you try to recreate the noise to make sure, that was me. I did that. And you listen and you feel glad to know that you're alone because that other thing is creeping you out. He could have had what Joyce called an epiphany, a revelation about truth. He let it die down. He could have been someone who learned something from the painful case of his relationship with her. Instead, he's too frightened, and so he retreats into a kind of paralysis. But that's not all, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who've been paying attention, that goods train, beyond the river he saw a goods train winding out of Kingsbridge Station, like a worm with a fiery head. We've gone well beyond sausages now. It is winding obstinately and laboriously. In the movie Some Like It Hot, Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, Marilyn Monroe, the men dress up as women, and Tony Curtis has to remind Jack Lemmon, you're a girl, you're a girl, you're a girl. You have to act like a girl. They're running from the mob, the St. Valentine's Day, and when he says like a girl, it moves to the train pistons going, that's sex. Laboriously, but he has to say, I can't have sex, I'm supposed to be a girl. That worm with a fiery head is a phallus, and obstinately and laboriously is the sex. And this man wants to get rid of that. Why should the train remind him of her name? Because he makes the implicit connection, the silent connection, the parabolic connection, that the train somehow is an image of sex, is the sound of sex, sound always in Joyce, and associates it with her because that's what he fears she wanted. It may not be insignificant that the first syllable of her last name is Sin, S-I-N. She's Mrs. Sinico. He's not put off by the fact that she's a married woman. In fact, he likes the idea that she's married and therefore safe, that he won't have to deal with her sexually. But there's sex again in the line, and it amplifies his painfulness because it gave him, his imagination, his instincts, gave him a hint of what was possible, and he actually feels bad about what he's done until he doesn't.
Well, the fact that the train is moving obstinately and laboriously
Right.
tells you how he feels about what might have been lying ahead head form.
Right, and also, let's be candid, it's an image of sex. If you're any good at it, Woody Allen, there's some element of laboriousness in it. Right, absolutely. Now, you may say in these few examples, well, is this everywhere? There are other kinds of examples, but I give these only because this is this argument that what Catholicism, in Joyce's view, has done to the country, and why, even though he is deeply imbued with love of his religion emotionally, intellectually he feels he has to disown it. So I have enough time to do one more from The Dead. The Dead, I think, is one of the greatest stories written in English ever. And the opening line of The Dead is, Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet. Now, this is a story called The Dead, and the first word of The Dead is the word lily, which is a flower of death, a flower of resurrection, a flower of life and death. Joyce knew how to write. Joyce, in his own voice, would never say she was literally run off her feet. She wasn't literally run off her feet. But Lily would say she was literally run off her feet. So what Joyce does in that opening line is, symbolically, he had the name of the maid connect to the idea of the dead. Because how many of you have read The Dead ever? So you know that the kicker in The Dead is a dead man. Turns out to be very significant to poor Gabriel, who thinks he has to compete with him. But that dead man is gone. But he's a ghost who's present in the story as a memory, and very powerful presence. So he quite symbolically puts Lily in the story, and then naturalistically, he channels what Lily would say about herself. Lily, plopping down, feels, I'm literally run off my feet. So he channels her language into the third person narration, even as he also does this symbolic thing that Lily knows nothing about. Am I making sense? He's doing more than one thing in a single sentence. Gabriel Conroy, who is the center of The Dead and another version of Joyce if he had stayed in Ireland, when he first enters the house is described this way, and this will have to be the end of my talk, I think, tonight. The high color of his cheeks pushed upwards even to his forehead, where it scattered itself in a few formless patches of pale red. And on his hairless face, there scintillated restlessly the polished lenses and the bright gilt rims of the glasses which screened his delicate and restless eyes. His glossy black hair was parted in the middle and brushed in a long curve behind his ears, where it curled slightly beneath the groove left by his hat. A completely naturalistic description of a well-shaven or hairless man who is wearing wire-rimmed glasses, has come in from the cold, has a ruddy complexion, has long hair that is brushed back behind his ears, and has a circle on his head from where the hat was. But this is Joyce. So what do we notice? The groove left on his head is like a halo. You think I'm making this up? His name is Gabriel. Gabriel is one of the two great archangels in Christian devotional thinking. The other great archangel is Michael. The dead boy in the story is Michael. Michael is the warrior archangel. He's the one who chases Adam and Eve out of the garden. Gabriel is the messenger angel. He's the one who says, Hail Mary, full of grace. So Gabriel is going to be our messenger, and Michael is the guy who is heroic. How do we know that? His last name is Fury. Michael Fury is the man that Greta pined for when she was younger. Now, a lot of Joyce's readers wouldn't put this together any more than you might have. And the point isn't that you missed it. The point is it's there if you want not to miss it. That there's always more in Joyce. So he has this groove. Does it make him an angel? No. Does his name being Gabriel make him an angel? No. Does the fact that his face is radiated make him an angel? No. Why? Because there's a lot of things about him that's not angelic. The glasses screen his delicate and restless eyes. These are not sunglasses. I wear glasses. They don't screen my eyes. They make it possible for me to see. We're going back to the eyes again. For the narrator to say that the glasses screen his eyes that are restless reminds us that he is vulnerable, that he's someone who has to be protected. And you may remember that he signs stories or opinion pieces that value the British part of Ireland, the eastern part. He doesn't like the old country, the purely Irish part. That's where Greta was from. That's where Michael Fury was from. And she, Molly Ivor, says to her, are you the person who signs your little things GC? Are you that writer? And he feels assaulted by her. He says to Lily, who is almost a member of the family, this is the home of his aunts and a cousin. He says to Lily, I imagine before long you'll be getting married. And she says bitterly, oh, the men today, they're all palaver. They're all malarkey. And he feels embarrassed that she lashed out at him, and he gives her a tip. He shouldn't be giving her a tip. She's family. It's the Feast of the Epiphany. You wouldn't give a tip to someone who's essentially a member. But he's so embarrassed, he screens himself by making it commercial. It's not an accident that that train that pushes laboriously is a goods train. It's a commercial train. The train that matters so much at the end of Anna Karenina, if you haven't read it by now, it's your own fault. That train does a bad thing to Anna Karenina. It's not a passenger train. It's a commercial train. She's being done in by the society. So this idea that he's angel-like is not to tell us he's like an angel, but to show us the gap between his being an angel. It's what's called mock heroic. You reference Hercules to make the point that this guy is no Hercules. It's like if I said to someone, okay, Einstein, not nice. I invoke Einstein to make the opposite point. He's restless, he's vulnerable, he's timid. This is not a cold, this is allergies. And he is frightened and intimidated by the fact that Michael Fury seems to be everything that he's not. I'm going to end it there and say that this is kind of a whirlwind, but if you have it in you to read or reread Portrait, or especially Dubliners, or however many chapters of Ulysses you can read, it will help you for next time. I'm not going to promise you that in an hour and 15 minutes next time you're going to go away understanding Joyce. This is not an infomercial. Wait, there's more. But you will be a better reader of Joyce, I think you are now, and you will be after another hour and 15 minutes. And my advice to you is, if you can read the first 4 chapters of Ulysses closely, and maybe read them twice, you will be well situated for next time. And if you don't come back, or you ever want to read all of Ulysses in the future, I tell you the same advice I tell my undergraduates, and this is true, I'm not giving you the Guilford grown-up patronizing view. Read every line, if you can, in a chapter, and if you say to yourself, I'm going on automatic pilot, this particular chapter, and there are a couple like that, makes no sense to me anymore, read the last 2 pages of that chapter carefully, and then go on to the next chapter. Read enough of a chapter to get a sense, oh, they're in the library, they're talking about Shakespeare, and if you start to feel that your reading is just like penance, stop, but read the last few pages of the chapter, and then do that for every chapter, even if you wind up not reading 40% of the book. And when I say to you that I tell this to my undergraduates, that includes the undergraduates who are reading Ulysses in a course. I don't usually teach Ulysses. I wouldn't tell graduate students to do that. I wouldn't tell the future teachers of Joyce to do that. But I tell my students in regular college course, they can't believe it. So this won't be on the test? No, it won't be on the test. But your understanding of James Joyce will be on the test. I'm going to give you some, not you, I'm going to give you some passages and see what you do. You will be a better reader of Joyce if you lose your fear and you do the kind of thing you did earlier. If you think, could this be that? Maybe this is an example of that. Or the thing that you said about the laboriousness being, he didn't want that kind of life. And this was an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you very much. You see why you're lucky to have showed up? Thank you for having me. I'm really not that egocentric, but it's good for marketing.